So what we're going to do today is talk about measurement, which is one of the really critical issues. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some examples. I'm also going to talk about something called Fermi estimation, and I'll come back to that later. It's named after Enrico Fermi, the famous physicist, and it's a very useful tool for entrepreneurs. Measurement is one of the areas that I think businesses and in particular nonprofits do very poorly. So let me go through and give you some examples, et cetera. So as I said, measurement is critical for both for-profits and nonprofits. It serves as a scorecard, and if you do it wrong, which I'm going to provide an example, it can lead to disastrous outcomes. So what I'll do today is I'm going to provide a paradigm for you. It's very simple. It's not sophisticated, but gives you an idea of the four elements of measurement. How metrics can drive organization strategy and success or failure. Provides examples of key metrics used by different types of organizations. And I do a lot of work. I was on the board of numerous companies, but I also do work with nonprofits. And I'm going to use a couple of nonprofit examples because I serve on something called the Bank of America Client Foundation Board, and we get proposals, and I'm in my office and looking at about 50 of them, and they're so poorly done that it's almost a motivation to want to give the same lecture to all those organizations because they don't understand the critical issue, which is measuring impact, and I'll come back to that. And then lastly, I'm going to provide you with what you do when you have very little data, which is very common for entrepreneurs. And I'm going to go through a personal example that I have that about 10 years ago, or more like 20 years ago now, saved me by doing some very simple calculations. So let's start out with a story about a large telecom. So a large telecom has decided to replace a significant part of its customer service staff with an automated answering system that answers customers' inquiries. You probably all have been subject to this when you dial 1-800-HELP-ME on one of the telecoms or internet sites or whatever, and they have these bots, and the bots, you have to spend 10 minutes just trying to find a person. So the head of the operations has estimated that by introducing technology, an automated answering system, they can save the business about $10 million a year because they can decrease the size of the staff. And the cost of the system is about $18 million. Now, this is a real example, but I'm hiding the exact numbers, but the magnitudes are roughly the same. Using a cost of capital of 15%, projecting 10 years out, the firm estimates that the payout is approximately $58 million. This is a very good investment. $18 million investment, $58 million payback. What organization wouldn't want it? The input, and I'm going to come back to why I'm covering it this way. The input is an automated answering system. The activities of the organization are identifying the most cost-effective systems. The output is labor savings and ROI. And I'll come back and I'm going to add one more component to this later on. So what do you think happened? You may be able to guess. Well, the head of operations is expecting a large raise due to the high expected ROI. He's done a fantastic job, introduced the system. Everybody's excited in the operations part of the organization. And why don't I get a big bonus as head of operations? Good investment? Sounds like it. All the numbers look right. So let's look at what was missing. The firm implemented the system and found tremendous customer backlash. A survey conducted by the firm found that 71% of the customers were dissatisfied with the firm's customer service. It's almost impossible to get a number that high. The financial impact was twofold. Customer retention dropped from 91% to 78%, and economically, that's a huge drop. And then new customer acquisitions based on seeing reviews dropped by 26%. So let's just review what happened. The operations people measured it in operational terms. We saved X dollars per year by having this kind of a system because we could decrease labor. They were very happy with the labor savings. If you're an accountant for that organization, you were probably very excited about the cost savings. The problem was they failed to understand who to measure. Part of what the measurement needed to be was, were customers satisfied with the service? Could they have built a little beta testing tool and seen what kind of reaction customers had? And the result was that it ended up being fairly disastrous for the firm. So the key lesson is output measures, high ROI projects were very favorable, but impact measures, and I'm going to keep emphasizing output versus impact, customer satisfaction, retention rates, and customer acquisitions were highly negative. So output, seeing the short-term economic payout was very high, but the long-term impact on what was going to happen to customers was very negative. So it's not enough to just measure outputs. You must focus on measuring impact, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So here's a very simple paradigm that I use to think about measurement. I start out and I have inputs. Then I have activities. So inputs are, in this example that we were just going through, the input was going to be a labor-saving customer bot tool that was available to decrease the number of customer service reps. The activities was identifying the right kind of system. The output, and they used as outputs things like payback and what kind of return on investment. But as I just said, the impact was the big problem. The impact was decrease in the number of customers, very dissatisfied customers, and over the long run, losing customers equals lost revenues, et cetera. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to explain each of these concepts, each of these terms to you. Some of them are pretty obvious, but I want to really emphasize outcomes versus impact. So inputs are the resources, data, or materials that are fed into the system. Raw materials, information, human resources are examples of inputs. Activities are the stages. The stage involves the process or activities that transform the inputs into outputs. It's really the processes that the firm uses. It can include various methods, techniques, or workflows. Outcomes are the tangible or intangible results of the activities. Outcomes can be goods, services, reports, or deliverables produced. Common measures for profit organizations are sales margins and profits. And this is the one that you really have to begin to think about, impact, the long-term effect of the activities. Impact reflects the effectiveness of the processes and can include changes in behavior, knowledge, conditions, results from the outcome. For profits, it provides information about the long-term effects of the strategies and investments of the firm. And the difficulty is that when we make business decisions and somebody comes to you and says, I've got an investment that we can make in decreasing labor and customer service, you look at it and go, that sounds like a terrific idea. The question is, what is going to be the impact, and are we going to measure the right kinds of things, and can we measure enough before the fact so that we can anticipate that we might have those kinds of problems? So outcome is a type of summative evaluation that focuses on the observable effects of a program. Impact is another type of summative evaluation that examines a program's long-term goal and broader effects, and I'm going to provide a couple of examples from nonprofits in a second. So outcomes are often short-term and measurable. Impacts can be long-term and sometimes subjective. So let me go through a nonprofit example with you and help start to make this concrete. Actually, I'm going to do two. One is from something in Minnesota, which I'll explain it in a minute, and the other is an example from the Gates Foundation, and they're both nonprofits. So in the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's something called Twin City Rise, and a friend of mine developed this. And he and I have spent a lot of time, and he wrote a book about this, talking about impact. And I'm going to use, and the reason I'm using this as an example is it had a huge beneficial effect on their organization. So what Twin City Rise does is it finds solutions to the poverty experienced by many people of color, but they don't automatically always have to be of color. It assists individuals in finding stable and well-paying employment. That is really the critical issue. Now, if this were a classroom and I could stop and I could ask you a question, how would you measure that? Well, that is the critical issue. What do you measure in terms of are they well-paying employment? And I'll come back to that in a second. So I'm going to abbreviate it as TCR. Twin Cities Rise focuses on individual development, personal empowerment, career training, and the 21st century skills that today's employees are searching for. And one of the things that they learned was, and by doing the right kinds of measurements, a lot of organizations that do what they do, it's all about, we'll teach you how to write a resume, we'll sit you down and you can have a discussion, and we'll try to show you how to do interviews. They developed a much more fundamental approach to it, which was to try to really recognize that a lot of the participants had some emotional issues, and they would go to work, become very angry, and lose their job 30 days into the job, that they had to work on their emotional behavior as well as their skills in terms of interviewing and so on. And so that was one of the big advantages that they had, but it came through measurement. So what would you measure if you were TWC? Well, the competition, and I call it competition, other social service organizations, and I see this in the kinds of proposals I'm about to read, a lot of data on the number of people served. So I'm an organization, I'd say 28 people came to our program. That's a measure, and it is. Is it a critical measure? It is an important measure, but I'm going to classify that as an input. It's like the raw material that you have. Then the other measure that they commonly use is cost to serve. I had 28 people. Our budget for this program is $28,000. It costs us $1,000 per person in terms of our cost to serve. That's a process measure. Now, a lot of organizations think that that is the end all. What we want to do is drive down cost to serve, and therefore we're a good organization. Doesn't mean that you've had any real effect on the participants. Twin City Rise came up with a whole different set. They use some of the same measures: cost to serve, lack of criminal recidivism, which means that you were a criminal and then you come back and become a criminal again. That's an outcome measure and a critical measure, because a number of the people that they served were criminals in the Minneapolis, Minnesota, and St. Paul area. And avoiding recidivism obviously has a big impact on their ability to earn money in the longer run. But they also went out, and I'll come back to this in a second, they looked at 2-year salaries. What happened among the graduates after they left the program? And what they found is that they were able to double and triple their annual income. Now, why did they use 2 years? And this is really a critical issue, because you can look at something over 30 days. We got you a good job working for the ABC organization, and you were earning $12,000 a year. You're now earning $35,000 a year. Aren't we fantastic? But the question is, what's the long-term impact of this? Is it just a short-term metric? You know, we got people higher salaries. And I see this in many different ways, and I'll come back to a different example for profit in a little while, that what you see is, you see people doing these kinds of measures of a short-term impact, but this is a short-term outcome, but this is really an impact measure. And this is what they want to accomplish. Now, why is this so difficult, and why do so few organizations do it? It requires developing a database about your participants, whether they're consumers or whether they're part of a nonprofit organization, and then tracking them over time. And this is difficult. So being able to measure impact, and that's why earlier on, sometimes it's more qualitative than quantitative, measuring it requires a lot of effort. And in general, I would say on all the organizations I've been part of, nonprofits, it's all about developing databases and then tracking people over time. And it is not common. Now, what difference does it make? And they had an ROI impact, and I'll come back to that. The most important was the economic impact on Minnesota. So they were partly funded by the state of Minnesota, and they were able to show them an ROI. And how were they able to show them an ROI? Because they could look at how much did salaries increase, and then what was the economic impact on Minnesota. So now that people are earning, instead of $12,000, they're earning $35,000 or $45,000 a year. They're paying income tax. They're paying state income tax. They're buying goods and services, so they're paying sales tax, so on. They're also requiring less services that they can't pay for. And so the Twin Cities Rise and the state of Minnesota did an economic analysis and found that they had a very high ROI for the state of Minnesota. So what was the impact? They could see that the programs generated an additional net positive cash flow. And then other programs use just the outcome measures that I mentioned, something like cost to serve. And what they found out that funding was significantly less than Twin Cities Rise. So this is an example of focusing in on what kind of impact do you have. I'm going to do one other example real quickly, and that's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They distributed over 200 million insecticide-treated beds that's in sub-Sahara Africa. And the purpose of it was to try to decrease the number of people that were dying from malaria. So they trained healthcare workers in 15 countries on malaria diagnosis and treatment. They had a significant increase in the use of beds by families in high-risk areas. And local healthcare capacity improved with more accurate and timely diagnosis of malaria. Is this an impact? Well, you can ask yourself that question, and you probably can guess by what I'm doing. The answer is only partially. What they really found out was that malaria deaths reduced by 45% between 2020 and 2023. And you have to give the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation tremendous credit, because instead of just stopping with, well, we do, a lot more people are now using beds with certain type of netting. We have people going to the hospital and learning what to do and so on. They really went and got to the next level, which was measuring the most important outcome, which was the number of deaths being reduced. So this shows that while the output is a large-scale distribution of beds and nets and training sessions, the real impact was, as I just said, the reduction of deaths and increased use of preventive methods. So those are two examples from nonprofits. I'm going to change the subject, and this is a concept I taught a class at Tepper about forecasting, and this was one of the areas that I really thought had a huge impact, potential impact for Tepper students and other students, and that is how do you estimate metrics in low data settings? So you're starting a business. Maybe the business has been in operations for a year or two, but you have very limited data. What do you do? So I'm going to give you an example of a company that I helped, and they offered me a chance to invest in their stock, and I'll show you what I did. So a common problem is lack of data or limited data for a venture. A potential solution is something called Fermi estimation. And Enrico Fermi was a famous physicist who won the Nobel Prize. He was involved in the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, which you can have whatever opinions about that you want. But he was a brilliant man. And the story goes that he would be hiring somebody. They'd walk into his office, and he was at the University of Chicago and then something called Argonne Labs in the Chicago area. You'd walk in and he'd look at you and he'd say, how many people died in Chicago last year? And you're there, you've got all these credentials from Carnegie Mellon, you're well known and a student or a professor in physics. And here's the question he's asking, and you're going, what in the heck is he talking about? He said, no, I'm dead serious. I want you to give me an answer to that. And what he was interested in is the process that you followed. He didn't really care whether the number was X, Y, or Z. He cared about the process. And so it's become either a Fermi problems or Fermi estimation. I like to call it Fermi estimation. So I'm going to provide an example. And as I said, it was named after Enrico Fermi. And they're back of the envelope calculations. And you're younger than I am, obviously. I've used this idea. I didn't even know it was called Fermi estimation or Fermi problems. But the idea, you're sitting in a board meeting and somebody throws up a data point of some kind, and your requirement is to try to figure out, is that reasonable? Or somebody comes to you and they're planning to start a business, and they're going through some of the finances of it, and you're going, let's break this down and try to see whether it makes any sense. So Fermi estimation is something you can go online and find all about it. I'll show you an example, but I think it's one of the great tools that entrepreneurs ought to have. So, and one thing to remember, it is not going to provide the perfect answer. It's going to provide an approximation. So let me show you how this worked. So in 2001, during the dot-com era, an entrepreneur, I was on the board of a company with him, and then he started a company in the vitamins, herbs, and supplements business. And he asked me if I knew somebody who could help him in marketing. And I knew somebody who was an MIT student who was very quantitative. And he had called me a few weeks before and said, if you know of any interesting entrepreneurial businesses, put me in touch. So I put him in touch. They hit it off, and he hired him. And so this business was up and going, and I'll come back and explain what that means in a second. The question I have is, if you're in the vitamins, herbs, and supplement business, does it have a USP, a unique selling proposition? What differentiated it? Well, we've covered that. I lectured about that a few weeks ago. This business, in my mind, did not have a USP, but that's not what I'm going to cover with you. But it's a good question to ask. And you start looking at it and going, how many other firms can create a website on vitamins, herbs, and supplements? Could CVS, could Walgreens, could vitaminshop.com be created, which it did. So the question is, what is the business model and does it make any sense? So as I said, I helped them hire the chief marketing officer. And so there was something, still exists, friends and family. I could buy in at a much lower price than the stock was going to be offered on the marketplace. Big opportunity to make some money. This was the way they were going to pay me back for the help I gave them. The question is, should I do it? Should I buy? So I sat down and I started to say, I could put the money in and there's no guarantees, but is this a good investment or not? So I started asking that question. So the first thing I asked was, and I had an extensive background in this area. I used to do a lot with the direct marketing industry, which is now, Google and Amazon and all these people. But by 2001, it was just emerging in the dot-com world. But I knew a lot about the economic model that the firms used. And so the question was, how much does it cost you to acquire a customer? And this is a question, if you're an entrepreneur, you better know the answer to this question. This is independent of Fermi estimation or what I'm going to cover with you. This is a critical issue. And I'm helping an entrepreneur right now who has a product. And I keep asking him this question, and he says, I'll get back to you. And he does not have any idea what it's going to cost him to acquire a customer. And that's going to explain whether he's going to be successful or not, as you'll see in this example. Anyway, their cost was $400 to acquire a customer. Now think about it. They're selling vitamins, herbs, and supplements. It's costing you $400 to acquire a customer. Does that make any economic sense? Can I make money spending that much money? Now, one of the things that they told me was, well, we're going to drive this cost down. It's not going to be $400 in the long run. It may be $250. We might be able to have it. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? Well, and they give you the marketing talk and so on. And you go, well, maybe, maybe not. But let's just stick with $400 for the time being. And I'll show you that it wouldn't matter that much. Do you think that that's viable? Well, I'll come back and I'll show you. So I used Fermi estimation to answer it. I didn't call it Fermi estimation. I just asked certain questions, got certain data, approximated things, and said, here's what I think is the answer. So the first one is, how much does the average customer purchase per purchase occasion? So you're selling vitamins, herbs, and supplements. How much do you think that they spend? Well, here's what I said. Well, I'll come back. I'm sorry. What is the annual frequency of purchase? How many times a year? What are the profit margins? Well, they knew what the profit margins were, but I didn't know the profit margins, but I'd done a lot of work, as you heard from the introduction, in retailing, so I had a pretty good idea of what kinds of margins existed in vitamins, herbs, and supplements. What were the delivery costs? And then lastly, what is the retention rate per purchase occasion? So let's slow down and look at the question. How much does the average customer purchase per purchase occasion? I estimated that they spent $35. I actually think that's pretty high. So you go to a vitamins, herbs, and supplements store, will you spend $35? Some of you may do that and have a better feel for it than I do. And I know that these are moderately expensive products. So I estimated $35. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, I thought. What's the average frequency? I said 4 times a year. So if you take 4 times a year, $35, you get $140 annual expenditure. Just start to think about that. I'm spending $140 a year. Now, this is in revenue, not in profit. I'm spending $400 to acquire a customer. How many years before there's a payout in terms of what that customer is generating? A long time. I mean, you can do the calculation. It takes 3 years just to get the revenue back. That's $420. That's not profit. So right away, I started to say, how is this business going to be viable? But let's do a couple more steps. So what kinds of profit margins are there? I said, it's a fairly high margin business. They can buy effectively. They might be able to make 70%. So they're generating $140 a year. They're generating 70% profit. All right. So you take that and you get a number which is $98, but let's call it 100. Okay. So $100, it's costing me $400 to acquire them. Is this going to be viable? I'm getting nervous. What are the delivery costs? Well, I assume $5, 4 times a year, it's $20. That's probably somebody like Amazon has really figured out how to do this, but they probably couldn't come close at $5. Depends on what shipping systems they used and so on. And but I use $5. And then and this was another critical question. What repeat purchase rate per customer occasion? So I said, and I know this is how it works in customer retention models. The first year you get about a 50% retention rate, then a 75%, then a 90%. Now, these are, this is Fermi estimation. I don't know the numbers, but this is what I'm estimating the number is. Okay. Now, I put it in a spreadsheet so I could easily change these and see if I said it's 70% on the first purchase occasion, would it make any difference? So one of the things you can do is you can do some kind of evaluation of how robust is the outcome of what you're thinking about, which is what I did. I just put it up in Excel, played around with some different numbers. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. And I found that it's not very, there are a lot of different assumptions that make the outcome what I'll describe in a second. So the net profit before acquisition using Fermi estimation is $78 per customer, assuming a 3-year life. The profit per purchase occasion after 3 years was as low as $3. You purchase 4 times a year. That's generating a profit of $12. So you can see that it's $80 roughly after 3 years. Add another 2 years and you still only get to 100. So the real key is, can you retain the customers and keep them? Because that's what's going to really drive your long-term purchase rates. So you're probably guessing where this is going. You think it's a good business. Well, what do you think I did? Should I invest? So this was what happened. So the chief marketing officer, who I knew quite well, said, I was the only person who did not take advantage of the pre-public offering friends and family option. Everybody else thought they were going to become super rich. Here's what happened to the business. The company went bankrupt. It went through $180 million in capital in 18 months and entered bankruptcy. It basically was worth nothing. And why did it go through so much money? Think about what that customer acquisition cost was. Think about the fact that they're having to build an inventory, et cetera. And the CEO who I knew told me that when they went to the VC world and showed them their business plan, et cetera, one of the VCs walked up to him and said, "Would you mind stepping into the men's room?" I apologize for this part of it. He said, "I don't want to have other people here. I'm going to give you the money right now if you say yes." And he did the deal, lost $180 million. So what's the lesson? The hype of the dot-com. The reason I use this example is I think there's something called the hype of the AI. Now, it may not look like what happened to dot-coms. It's always hard to know, but it's amazing how over the last year to 2 years, everything you read about, if you're an investor, is AI, AI, AI. It's a frenzy. I did it. I analyzed this business with a very simple, basic model. And what I found was it wasn't even close to economically viable. When I mentioned this to the chief marketing officer after the fact, he used to come to my class when I taught at Northwestern. I used it as an example and he didn't mind. He kept telling me they were sure they could drive down the acquisition cost. That was one of the big issues. They never got close. So these kinds of analyses and these kinds of metrics help you think through how to think about a business. So even if they're approximations, the critical issue is you don't have to have it perfectly, have the numbers or the measures perfect. You just have to have the right process, understand the process, and think about what the numbers might be, and then put in some simulations of different numbers and see what are the conditions where the business is successful and not successful. So I've emphasized numerous times in the last 10 minutes, Fermi estimation. You ought to get up and find out how to do it. It's a process, and basically the key is you break down the process into different steps. I started out talking about Fermi and turning to somebody and saying how many deaths were there in Chicago. Let's just use births. And what he wants to do is he wants to see how you break that problem down. Do you say, well, I have no idea. I guess I'd go to the library and try to look it up. Well, this is 1945, 1942, and the library, and they probably don't even have the data. What he wants you to do is say, okay, well, how, if we're going to have the number of births, how many women are of age, the relevant age? Well, let's say the average person lives to 70 years old, and let's just assume a uniform distribution. How many people are between, say, the ages of 20 and 35? So 1/5 of the population. Okay. Then you say, how many of those are going to have a child in a year? Well, let's say the average number of people, births per family is 2 or 3, whatever the number is, and you work that out. And then you say, what's the population of Chicago? And you do these kinds of calculations. And so it's the process of breaking down a decision process into steps and then coming up with the answer. Last comment I'm going to make, and then I'm going to cover one more topic with you. The last comment I'm going to make is that the process I just outlined for you of going through and saying acquisition cost, cost of goods, et cetera, retention rates, number of purchases per year, that model is an extremely powerful model. It's the model that the direct marketing industry, it's the model that the Amazons of the world and all the sophisticated direct marketers and database marketers use today. It's existed for years and years and years. I learned it when I first started teaching from a company that was in the direct marketing industry. It's a very powerful model. Think about what kind of retention rates do you have, what kind of acquisition rates, and so on. And I wrote a book, and the book is about something called customer equity. Customer equity means what's the value of a customer? And trying to figure that out when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a business, how much are those customers going to be worth over the long run? And what factors are going to drive that? And can we measure that? Becomes really critical. And that gets back to the whole point is it's all about impact. One more topic, and then I'll open it up for questions. I like to think about the world of business in two types. And this is significantly oversimplified, but it helps you a little in thinking about what kinds of metrics you would use. The first are high fixed, low variable cost businesses, things like airlines and telecoms. The other is low fixed cost, high variable cost businesses, online retailers, restaurants are just examples. Now, why do I separate these? Because when you're thinking about what you want to measure and how you think about how you're going to generate revenue and so on, it varies by the type of business that I just described. So high fixed cost businesses focus very much on ROI on investments. Let's just think about an airline. You're going to start, you're probably not going to do this, but you're JetBlue, it's 20 years ago, you're going to start a business and so on. What's the big investment? Obviously, the planes, the infrastructure systems that you have to acquire, et cetera. But once you have that plane, which is a very high fixed cost, you've got 4 people or 5 people on that plane, which is fixed labor. What do you want to do? You want to drive incremental customers. So if you look at certain kinds of businesses that are high fixed cost businesses, they spend a lot of time focused on driving incremental customers into the same fixed cost operations. Telecoms. I mean, if you turn on, I like to watch sports, you turn on a sporting event, the number of ads that you see from the telecoms is mind-boggling. Buy this phone, do this, do that, et cetera. And the whole game is how they can add incremental sales to the existing fixed cost network that they have. The other thing you look at in those businesses, they use very sophisticated pricing systems. And why do they do that? Because if I can price discriminate, I can charge higher prices to certain segments and lower prices to others, I can increase my incremental revenue. So you look at the airlines, and they're always looking at, they have yield management systems to try to figure out how much I can generate in terms of an incremental customer. All right. And it's 2 hours before the plane takes off. They're willing to offer all kinds of fantastic deals because if I can get 3 more customers on, that's money that it's basically a fixed cost. I have no real operating cost for those additional customers. Now, the other kind of business, I'm sorry. So in those kinds of businesses, you focus on things like pricing, incremental customer. In terms of high variable cost businesses, then the answer becomes drivers of cost to serve the customers. Instacart was just in the news, and because I was on the board of a grocery retailer, we talked about it quite a bit for a little while, and it was very successful during the pandemic because nobody wanted to go to the grocery store. They all wanted to order their groceries. They're having a lot of trouble. And when you look at their business, what are the drivers of their costs? It's serving the customer. They have people going through a grocery store, picking out the items, and then making it and then delivering it to your home. It's a very high labor cost business. So they just hired a new CEO over the last 6 months, a woman, and she came up with a new strategy for them. She wanted to understand what are some of the potential drivers of incremental costs. And she did something really smart. So she came from, and I can't remember, but it was probably something like Pinterest or one of the companies who make a lot of money from advertising. She said, "Why don't we start advertising to the customers?" Well, all the people at Instacart get nervous and said, "Well, we'll lose all our customers. They don't want to see ads." And this is what she did that was really smart, and it goes back to measuring impact. She actually did a study to find out whether customers would mind seeing ads. And what she found was the answer is they didn't mind. In fact, to some extent, they liked it. They're in the grocery store. I'm sorry, they're online buying groceries, and an ad pops up, a promotion for Heinz ketchup, and you go, I don't have enough ketchup. Yeah, that's great. It's 30% off. I might as well buy it. And so customers liked that potential service. And so the result, and it's still an open question, will they be successful with this driver? But what she understood, she had a high fixed cost business. I'm sorry, a high cost to serve business. She had to figure out how to get more revenue from those customers And she came up with the idea of incremental sales per customer through advertising. And it wasn't the customer paying for the advertising, it was advertised. So now you've heard these ideas. Let me just cover the key insights, and then I'm going to open it up to questions for you. Excuse me. No single or set of metrics fits every situation perfectly. We've gone through 4 different examples, and we have 4 different kinds of metrics. We had the telecom who failed to recognize how important it was to measure customer service and the impact of the problems they were having with customer service. We had Twin City Rise, which recognized that what we're going to do is look at 2-year, and if they could have 3-year income changes. I mean, that drove a high ROI in terms of what they were doing. We saw the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, which recognized that it wasn't enough to just measure how many people had netting on their beds. It was what happened to death rates from malaria. And then lastly, my example of, do you invest in this business using Fermi estimation? It was clear that there was a key metric, which was the cost of acquisition. Another critical metric was, what are the sales per year? And the third critical metric was, what kind of retention rates do we have? And when you put them all together, it was not a viable business. So successful businesses really do track metrics and really try to understand how they're both impacting outcomes and or having an influence on outcomes and impact. Let me just give you one last example, and it's from a nonprofit. And the reason I'm using nonprofits is because I think it's very important. You may not be involved in nonprofits now, but at some point in your life, maybe in the next 10 or 15 years, you'll be doing something with them, and you'll recognize what I'm saying is such a critical issue. The last example I'm going to give you is I was on the board of something for about 12 years called Youth Entity, and we did financial literacy programs, among other things. And we had a metric that we used, and I'm going to ask you outcome or impact, which was, we would have 3 or 4 sessions in high schools. And then at the end of it, the students would get a quiz to see if they were learning the material. And if they got the correct answer, for every correct answer, they got $1. And they could earn up to $15. And because we had 15 questions. And the issue became, is this enough in terms of measurement? I always felt that what we really wanted to look at was, over the long run, have we influenced them? So we would teach them basic concepts like budgeting. So you're going to college, you're taking this class, and now you're going to go to college. Did you build a budget? Did you try to look at how much it costs you to go to college? What kinds of jobs could you get, et cetera? So we measured what I called outcomes, but we never knew what the real impact was. And I could never get the organization, even though I was the chairman of the board, to build a database and start tracking impact. They said it was too hard. I don't think it was too hard, but so when we went to funding sources, one of the issues was, that's great, they're learning something about financial literacy, and financial literacy is a hot topic. We love it. But nobody really knew, did it have any real impact? And there were a couple of research papers written about it that implied that there was very little impact of having the students go through this. I'm not sure that's true, but it used to really concern me. So those are the key ideas. I'm going to just skip back real fast if I can. I may not be able to the beginning. And just highlight the last comments I want to make. Well, not working. Oh, there it is. So as you're starting to think about measurements, think about inputs. Those are relatively easy to identify. Activities, a little grayer. What kinds of activities, what processes are we using? And then obviously what I've just covered, which is outcomes, which are often very tangible measures like cost to serve in a nonprofit, what our sales are. So going back to Instacart, their sales weren't declining. The number of retailers they had weren't declining, but they weren't growing fast enough. And when they started to analyze it, their costs were going up faster than their ability to generate revenue. And that's what led the CEO to start asking the question, is this viable? And how can we come up with alternative ways to generate income? And that led to advertising. And then, as I said, the smartest thing that she did was go out to the customers, ask them the question, would this bother them? Obviously you have to be sophisticated in how you do that question. And the answer was it didn't bother them and they were in favor of it. And, so it'll be an interesting question. What happens to Instacart over the long run? So with that, I'll stop. I'll open it up to questions and answer anything that you would like.
Okay, if you want to come up and ask well.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your sharing today. I came in a little bit late, but I do find one of the problems that I was facing in the past very relevant to the topics today. When we were setting up metrics in the past, and obviously when there is a will, there is a way. So whatever the metrics we set up, there are different ways to circumvent it. And we do realize that potentially the largest constraint for any company to grow beyond our current scale, whatever that scale is, it is how we can somehow using metrics and performance valuation systems to kind of constrain employees from misusing those metrics or making up numbers to make their metrics feel better, but without actually looking into the long term. Do you think there could be somehow like a definitive balance between the complexity and usefulness of metrics and the long-term determination, long-term goal sharing with the company? It feels to us that it felt to me that in the previous experiences, the more metrics that we were using, actually our employees pay less attention to our long-term goals.
So there are a lot of things embedded in there.
Yes.
I'm going to answer the last one.
Okay.
You sort of implied the answer to it. Too many metrics is a problem. Going back to my example of the vitamin herb supplement company, they had all kinds of metrics. I didn't do it just because there were so many. I put up a series. I have a series of metrics that Instacart was using. They must have had 20 different metrics, and on a 1 to 10, they were all ones. They were basically useless. And telling me that they had 750,000 products that they had available. Who cares? I go to a grocery store. I'm only going to buy 100. That doesn't make any difference to me. So the point you were implying, or what you were implying, and the point I'm going to make is, you need to identify what are really the critical measures, and then you have to get accurate numbers from those, because it goes back to what you were saying. People start making up numbers. The first job I ever had, I worked for a company called Teledyne, and I was working for the chief accountant. I was between my first and second year at Tepper, and my job was to give the chief accountant and the CFO and the CEO what was happening each week in all of the divisions. I can't tell you how bad the numbers were that I was getting. And the problem was there was no disincentive to have the wrong numbers. If the CEO had dialed them up and said to them, this is not right, and I'm not going to tolerate it, it might have made a difference. So there has to be consequences to bad numbers. And, if you're running a business, the consequences are you may go out of business. But if you're getting it from customers and so on, it can be a real problem. And you have to figure out what kinds of incentives can I offer them to try to improve those numbers.
So in summary, it sounds like, the numbers are definitely quantitative. But you were mentioning a counterexample of the founder or the CEO actually just kind of blaming or kind of blatantly telling other people not to do something. That is not quantitative, that is qualitative. So you're kind of using, I think you're kind of using different systems to kind of mitigate the risk between each other.
And the third is, let's go back to what I said about Fermi estimation. Being able to judge, are those numbers reasonable? It takes some intuition, but can you assess, are those numbers reasonable? I mean, when you sit on a board and you get presentations from either management or third-party consultants or whatever, there's a lot of bad numbers that you see. And the trick is trying to figure out, A, are they important? If they're important, how do you benchmark? And some of it is trying to use your own intuition, like the example I gave. So being able to judge those numbers becomes quite important.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I have another question. So when considering for-profit social enterprise business with a binding dual mandate for profit and social impact, how should a company structured like this structure its impact metrics to ensure that they're developing a sustainable business while also making progress on their social impact goals? How do you strike that balance?
That's a good question. Well, striking the balance has to be the most difficult part of that, because you have to decide how important is the for-profit side versus the social impact side. And in a way, you could think of the for-profit side as an investment in the social impact. It's very difficult to answer that in the abstract, but it's a very good question. Um, uh, Understanding, so the first part of it is being able to collect the right kind of information. The for-profit business, even though I gave some examples, is probably on average easier. The real difficult part is what's the social impact, and using the word impact, not outcomes, what's happening over the longer run. And then what you can try to look at, like Twin City Rise did, what's the ROI on that? In this case, they looked at the ROI for the state of Minnesota. So can you come up with some kind of ROI for the nonprofit or social impact organization that you're working part, or that's part of the operations?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is Leah. So for the nonprofit that you were on the board of, and you were encouraging them to measure the impact, and they said it was too hard. Why was it too hard? What was the reason they were attributing the too hard to?
The ability to create a database and track people. So the database part was easy, I think. I mean, now they had 5,000 to 6,000 students that participated in the financial literacy program, but there are obviously great database tools. The more difficult question was, what's the incentive, or why should people continue to participate? So if I have gone through a financial literacy program, what incentive is there 2 years out for me to participate? And I don't think that they thought much about that. And I kept trying to emphasize, we've got to come up with some kind of a reward if you participate. Now, what does that do? It poses some issues in terms of the objectivity of the unbiased nature of the information. So being able to develop these databases takes a fair amount of effort. But if all you have to do is be part of a university or an alum. I'm an alum of Northwestern. I can't tell you how many emails, et cetera, I get from them. And no matter what I've ever done in life, they somehow have figured out how to track me without ever finding me, visiting me personally. So the issue is that there are tools that we could use, but it comes back to offering incentives and reasons to continue to participate. I think that was the most difficult part of it.